Welcome to the Beit Hamikdash with its holy service, lion-shaped structure, sacred vessels, fortified walls, hidden tunnels, the Para Aduma, miraculous stories, radiant beauty, musical instruments, and joyous festivities. These are only some of the sights we'll see on our tour of the second Beit Hamikdash. God commanded the Jewish people to build him a sanctuary, a holy place which would be his home. The Jews built the first and second temples in Jerusalem for this purpose. God described the third Beit Hamikdash to the prophet Yechezkel. He told Yechezkel that even after the Beit Hamikdash was destroyed, Jews could fulfill the commandment of building it by studying how it looked. Our tour takes us back 2,000 years to the time of the Beit Hamikdash, and will bring us closer to the third Beit Hamikdash when the Mashiach comes. From the top of Mount Moriah, we can see the four walls surrounding the mountain on which the temple was built. Although the temple itself was destroyed, we can still see the remains of the walls at the foot of the mountain. All of the dirt and stones under the Beit Hamikdash were taken out. The hollow area had tunnels and arches which supported the massive building and the fortified walls which surrounded it. The Beit Hamikdash was not built in the center of these walls. More space was left on the southern and eastern sides. Our tour will lead us up the mountain from the south, just as our ancestors had. The first pilgrims to the Beit Hamikdash were Jerusalemites living in King David's city, which was built at the southern foot of the mountain. This remained the traditional entrance to the Temple Mount, even when the city grew to the west and north. These were the very steps that pilgrims coming to visit the Beit Hamikdash would ascend. They lead to the main entrance on the southern wall, called the Gates of Huldah. Here is where the prophetess Huldah stood during the time of the first Beit Hamikdash and guided the people in the way of the Torah. As we enter the Gates of Huldah, we walk up through a tunnel. At the top, we find ourselves in a pavilion between the temple and the southern wall. We see that the Beit Hamikdash was built on several levels, going higher and higher, blending into the slope of the mountain. Are you surprised that the main entrance to the Beit Hamikdash was not right here at the top of this tunnel? There's a good reason. King Solomon built the first Beit Hamikdash with the entrance on the east side, so that people would enter facing the most sacred area, the Holy of Holies, on the west. Before we come closer to the Beit Hamikdash, let's walk around the walls, where there are also other entrances to the Temple Mount. The wall on the east faces the Mount of Olives. In between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives is a deep valley. This towering wall makes the cliff feel even higher. On this side, Jews could enter the temple area from the gate of Shushan. The Persian rulers of Israel gave their permission to build the second Beit Hamikdash, insisting that the seal of their capital be engraved on the gate. The wall over the gate was lower than the other walls, so that when the high priest sacrificed the Para Aduma on the Mount of Olives, he could see into the entrance. The gates inside the temple area lined up with the gate of Shushan. Here we can look straight through the gates into the building. Let's continue around the walls. Here's the northern side with the Tadi gate. Tadi means hidden in Greek. This gate was not used by the general public, but rather by people who had to leave the temple area for personal reasons. For example, sometimes a Kohen became impure and had to leave the temple area. He walked quietly through the tunnels and out the Tadi gate. We now come to the most famous wall, the western wall, also called HaKotel. This is not only the closest wall to the Beit Hamikdash, but it is also right behind the Holy of Holies. Our rabbis said that the divine presence has never left the western site of the Holy of Holies. The entrance on this side is the Gate of Kaifonus, meaning a rose garden. The rose petals were used for the incense offering in the Beit Hamikdash. Now that we've seen all four walls, let's go back to the southern temple pavilion. As we look around us, we see these ornamental marble pillars which supported the roof. We now pass the Soreg, a low gate with a crisscross pattern. Signs on the Soreg in Hebrew and Greek stated which people were permitted to enter the temple area. As we approach the entrance to the temple, we see the Sanhedrin Haktana. People from all over the world brought questions of Jewish law to the Beit Hamikdash. Most problems were discussed here before they were brought inside to the High Court. We're finally about to enter the outer courtyard of the Beit Hamikdash. This courtyard is called the Ezrat Nashim. Here, inside this closed yard, another Sanhedrin Ketana discussed halachic problems. There was a chamber at each of the four corners of the Ezrat Nashim. At the left is the chamber of the Nazarites. A person who decided to become a Nazarite vowed not to cut his hair or drink wine for a certain period of time. When the time was over, he prepared sacrifices here. On the right side was the chamber for storing wood used on the altar. The Kohanim sat here and checked the wood. Any branches which had worms could not be used in the Beit Hamikdash. In this corner is the chamber of the Mitzoraim. People with tzorat used the mikveh in this room to purify themselves before bringing their sacrifices. Oil and wine were stored in the fourth chamber. The oil used in the Beit Hamikdash was prepared in carefully supervised oil presses. Only absolutely pure oil was allowed to be used. If we had visited the Beit Hamikdash on Sukkot, we would have joined thousands of other pilgrims celebrating Simchat Beit HaShoeva. The Levites stood on the steps leading up from the Ezrat Nashim and played harps, flutes, and trumpets. Rabbis danced in front of people juggling burning torches. A person who has not seen the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, we are told, has never seen true happiness in his life. The Ezrat Nashim was the scene of the Hakel gathering. Throngs of Jews crowded around a wooden platform which was set up for the king. They listened intently as he read aloud from the Torah. Being there was like being on Mount Sinai. Let's go up from the Ezrat Nashim on these 15 rounded steps. Here, up top, are the two giant bronze gates of Nicanor. Who was Nicanor? Why were these gates named after him? The Jews who rebuilt the Beit Hamikdash after the Babylonian exile were very poor. They could only afford simple wooden gates. Years later, a wealthy person named Nicanor decided to donate new gates to the Beit Hamikdash. Nicanor went to Egypt, where he ordered gates. They were cast by the best bronze craftsmen in the world. On the journey back, a storm broke out and the ship almost capsized. To make the boat lighter, the frantic crew threw one of the gates overboard. But the storm did not subside. In desperation, the crew started to throw over the second gate. Nicanor protested and cried out, "If you throw in the second gate, then throw me in as well." When Hashem saw his devotion, he stopped the storm, and the ship continued on its way. For the remainder of the journey, Nicanor was troubled. Maybe I could have saved the first gate as well. Imagine how surprised everybody was when the ship arrived at the port. The gate that had been thrown to the sea suddenly appeared from under the hull. Nicanor's gate was put up in the Beit Hamikdash. Our sages said that their bronze shined like gold. We are now standing in the inner courtyard of the Beit Hamikdash. It had many different chambers and special areas. We can see how this entire region was surrounded by a wall with gates. Whom did these gates serve, and what passed through them? Here, to our left, the water gate was located opposite the altar. On Sukkot, the water to be poured on the altar was joyously brought from the Shiloach spring through this gate. The firstborn animals were brought into the temple area through this second gate. Now we come to the gate of firewood. Chopped wood from the Lebanon forest was brought in through this entrance. At this corner, the highest point of the Temple Mount was called the Upper Gate. As we go around these inner walls behind the Holy of Holies, we pass these two small gates. Around this corner, we come to the Gate of the Spark. A small flame was kept burning here all the time. If the fire on the altar went out, it could be relit from this flame. The animals for the holiest sacrifices, the Kodshei Kadoshim, were brought through this gate. They could be slaughtered only on this side of the temple courtyard. Now we see the next gate. Women who brought sacrifices, for example after giving birth, came to the women's gate. This is the last gate on the northern side. It leads to the chamber of the hearth. We can see how part of this large domed building jutted out on either side of the wall. The area inside the wall was considered holy ground. Marking posts helped the Kohanim locate the side they were standing on. Does the name Chamber of the Hearth make you think of a fire? Indeed, a huge fire burned in the center of the building. This fire warmed the Kohanim, who walked barefoot on the cold marble floor and slept on stone slabs. The keys to the courtyard were guarded in a hideaway tile on the floor, right beneath the sleeping quarters. Each corner of this building had smaller chambers. In one chamber, young goats for the daily sacrifice were checked to make sure they were fit to be offered as sacrifices. The showbread was baked in another corner. It was offered each week on the sanctuary table. It was sometimes necessary to offer wine and fine flour in addition to the sacrifice. People came to the third chamber to purchase a token from a Kohen. The token was exchanged for wine and fine flour. In the fourth corner was a winding staircase leading to toilets and a mikveh for the Kohanim. Now that we've completed our tour of the inner courtyard, we'll return to the area where we entered, at the Nicanor gates. This is the Ezrat Yisrael. It had several chambers. To our right is the chamber of Pinchas, who was in charge of the garments worn by the Kohanim in the Beit Hamikdash. The Chavitim offering was prepared in another chamber. This was a daily sacrifice offered by the Kohen Gadol, to remind him of his responsibility to the Jewish people before God. In the right corner of the Ezrat Yisrael was the chamber of hewn stone. This is where the Sanhedrin Hagadolah, the supreme court of the Jewish people, held its sessions. Here Israel's 71 greatest sages judged and led the people. Next to the chamber of hewn stone was the chamber of the well, which provided water for the Beit Hamikdash, and the chamber of the Parhedrin, where the Kohen Gadol stayed and prepared himself during the week before Yom Kippur. The chamber of the salt stored the salt which was sprinkled on sacrifices. When we make hamotzi, we dip our bread into salt to recall the sacrifices in the Beit Hamikdash. Kohanim worked in two more chambers preparing the sacrifices. 3 steps separated the Ezrat Yisrael from the next area, the Ezrat Kohanim, with the constant hustle and bustle of busy Kohanim. These 3 steps are the Duchan, on which the Kohanim stood to bless the people. The Levim also played musical instruments and sang here, while sacrifices were being offered on the altar. Although we are now touring the Beit Hamikdash freely, anybody who was not a priest only entered this inner area when bringing a sacrifice. One obligation was to place his hands over the head of the animal. Although the altar looks small in this model, it was really very large, as you can see by the size of the Kohanim walking on it. Opposite the altar was an area for preparing sacrifices. Special rings held the animals securely in place. Short poles near the working tables were used to remove the hides. Between the altar and the temple building was a large copper basin, the kior. The Kohanim washed their hands and feet here to prepare for the service. We now have come to the main structure of the Beit Hamikdash. This building had 3 sections, the Ulam on the broad facade, and 2 narrow sections, the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. Can you see why this building reminded our sages of a lion's body? 12 steps led up to the Ulam gate. The entrance did not have doors, showing that the pathway to God is always open. A delicately embroidered curtain hung over it. Adorning the entrance from above were 5 beams of beautiful carved wood. On either side of the Ulam were chambers where the Kohanim stored their slaughtering knives. After the Ulam is the Heichal, the sanctuary. At its entrance was a golden chandelier donated by Queen Helene. The sun's rays at the break of dawn shone on the chandelier. Its brilliant reflection indicated that it was time to recite Shema. The entrance had 2 tables on either side, one of marble and the other of gold. A miracle occurred each week on these tables. The showbread to be offered was placed on the marble table, and the bread from the previous week was placed on the golden table. Even after 7 days in the Heichal, the bread was still fresh and warm for the Kohanim to eat. What's behind the gate of the sanctuary? Let's look. On the right was the golden table. The showbread was placed on it. On the left was the magnificent menorah. and in between was the golden incense altar. That incense was so strong that goats all the way over in Jericho sneezed from it. Let us look around at the outside of the sanctuary. These windows were narrow on the inside, but wide on the outside. The windows in our home are built to allow light to enter. These windows were different. They were made to spread out the spiritual light of the Beit Hamikdash. The light shone in the distance like a beacon. We are now approaching the most sacred place in the Beit Hamikdash, the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies. Behind two ornate curtains, which separated the Heichal from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, was the dwelling place of the Divine Presence, the Shekhinah. Once a year, on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim through both of these curtains. In this way, the Kodesh HaKadoshim was always hidden from view. Inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim was a large stone, the Even Hashtiah. The sages said the world was created from this stone. In the first Beit Hamikdash, the Aron HaKodesh was placed on this stone. In the second Beit Hamikdash, the Aron HaKodesh was not placed there. This is because King Solomon had a vision. He saw that the Jews would sin and that enemies would take the holy vessels. He built an underground vault, and King Josiah, the last of Judah's righteous kings, buried the ark inside it. Looking around the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKadoshim from the outside were storage compartments. Behind them was a winding staircase which led up to an attic. Every 7 years, Kohanim checked the area for damage. They lowered skilled craftsmen in closed crates over the Kodesh HaKadoshim to carry out repairs. The crates were closed so that the maintenance crew would not look at the beautiful walls of the Kodesh HaKadoshim more than necessary. The roof of the Kodesh HaKadoshim had tall spikes. They kept the birds from resting on the roof and staining its surface. Here on the roof of the Beit Hamikdash, looking upward, we conclude our tour. The sages tell us that the Beit Hamikdash on the earthly plane is located right below God's heavenly Beit Hamikdash. May Hashem rebuild our earthly Beit Hamikdash speedily in our days.